Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ara Serjui. I have the honor and the thrill of being a member of the Guilford College community. And I am very glad to see all of you joining us today for the September 2020 edition of the last Thursday of the month Coffee Chat with Guilford College. These programs are designed to showcase the brilliant minds that work at Guilford College while also creating an opportunity for alums, retirees, emeriti, benefactors, and friends of Guilford College to engage with us. With that, I'm going to ask for us to start with a moment of silence. Okay. So first of all, just a couple of housekeeping rules, if you would, please. We ask that you stay muted throughout the time of this coffee chat. It helps with the program quality when everyone is on mute. If you have a question that comes to mind through the program, please feel free to put it in the chat function. We ask that you reserve it for asking questions, and if we have time at the end of the program, then we will take your questions and address them at that moment. So with that, I'm going to get started with an introduction of our featured speakers. Wes Daniels is the William R. Rogers Director of Friends Center and Quaker Studies at Guilford College. He lives in Greensboro, North Carolina with his wife, Emily, and their 3 children. Prior to working at Guilford, Wes served as a Quaker pastor and has been active in Quaker communities across the theological spectrum of the Society of Friends. He is the author of Resisting Empire, the Book of Revelation, and A Convergent Model of Renewal, Remixing the Quaker Tradition in Participatory Culture. Wes is interested in strategizing better human interactions and the revitalization of liberatory faith traditions and community. Also with us this morning is a Guilford College alumna, Talisha Bowen, who is a licensed clinical mental health counselor. She is a graduate of Guilford College from the class of 2005 with a major in psychology and a concentration in communications. Talisha went on to earn her Master's of Science in Couples and Family Counseling from University of North Carolina at Greensboro in 2007. She has lived and worked in community mental health settings in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, providing in-home therapeutic services, crisis management, and training. She is a generalist with experience working with students presenting with family dynamic concerns, relationship challenges, depression, anxiety, ADHD, LGBTQIA+ needs, and has been back at Guilford College since 2018. So welcome, Talisha and Wes. I'm so glad you are our featured speakers today.
Thanks for having us. We're glad to be here.
Absolutely. And just a heads up, I have a fussy person who had a doctor's appointment. She's hanging out with me this morning. She was moving towards a nap and then I started, but she's been pretty good. But it is what it is in pandemic times, isn't it?
Well, and that right there perhaps is the best visual for reinforcing exactly what we are experiencing across the world. So thank you again, both of you and your little one, Talisha, for the props today. It's hard to believe, but we are now into the 7th month of a global health crisis. And on top of that, we have an increasing tense election season, while the fires of racism continue burning across our country. In fact, a decision that was made yesterday in Louisville, Kentucky, has once again reinforced the challenges that we have with respect to race and bigotry and lack of consequences for actions rooted in racism. So with all of that being said, Talisha and Wes, how are these things affecting people?
You know, I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody when I say that the most common response is feeling overwhelmed. We've had flare-ups of all of these things before, a little bit here, a little bit there, but I don't know that we've had this confluence, certainly not in my lifetime, and probably not in the lifetimes of most of the people who are here talking with us today. Rarely have so many kind of geopolitical, social, like natural events overlap so completely, and they'd be kind of near catastrophic on their own. And I think it's really easy, because it's been kind of day in, day out for 7 months, to kind of forget that there's a lot of loss that goes along with all of this grief and loss, right? The seniors from last year didn't get to have their big graduation ceremonies, and families didn't get to take like annual trips to the beach. And the fact that so many of us are working virtually as opposed to doing face to face, like those are losses, just like the 200,000 souls that we've lost in our country. Like it's really hard, I think, to come to terms with all of it. And it ends up just being overwhelmed, and grief. And people are trying so hard to balance and figure out where to put their energy and attention. And it's really, really hard to do. I hope that it also has people more willing to evaluate their needs. Do I need to go to the office every day? Can I work from home? Do I need to have that meeting? Can it be just an email? I hope that we can make good things come out of it, but I think overwhelmed is a good way to describe it. What would you say, Wes?
I'll figure out how to unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, everything Talisha said, I've just heard from folks in the last few days, kind of a recurring theme of people hitting the wall. And I don't know, this is probably a second or a third wall or maybe a fourth wall, but people are right in the last week, multiple people are talking about hitting a wall, having no energy, no motivation. And I think that's true of staff, faculty, and students, and I'm sure the rest of you. And so I think there's some of it that really is, we're out of our regular routines and the kinds of things that help us kind of cope, and so we're exhausted. And I think that another thing that is a concern to me really is the impact of all of this on the most vulnerable. So whether the most vulnerable, we're thinking about people in the Guilford community, or the most vulnerable in our country, who are the most likely people to be labeled essential workers? They're people without healthcare, people who are minimum wage workers, people who don't even, aren't even making $15 an hour to support their families. And they're the front lines in a lot of cases around the stuff that we're dealing with. So the vulnerable are greatly impacted. And I was reflecting again on just the crushing unemployment numbers right now. And that has serious impact. I know I've been involved with the Poor People's Campaign, and there's been a lot of effort around kind of raising awareness around all the evictions that are taking place. And so this is an important part to keep in mind. Not only is it hard for us and we're tired, which is very, very true and legitimate, but there are so many millions of people who are just hanging on by a thread. So those are pieces I think that are really important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Talisha. Hitting a wall, being overwhelmed, being exhausted, feeling loss and grief. And I think everybody on this session will agree with all, at least parts of what you've said. But let's perhaps start at a more granular level and talk a little bit about what happens in a person's brain when they are faced with so much adversity. Talisha, can you speak to that a little bit?
No, absolutely. We process adversity in our brains as a potential threat. Something's going wrong. Do I need to respond to it? How do I keep myself safe? So it probably doesn't surprise you that adversity activates kind of that very famous fight, flight, freeze response. So the mechanism is kind of centered with the amygdala, which is like a little almond-shaped structure in your brain. It's in the temporal lobe. It's kind of a little bit above your ear, about 3 inches in, and it's a parallel structure, so you've got it on both sides of your brain. It's a part of the limbic system, which is the structure that plays kind of a major role in memory and decision-making and emotional response. So when we face a specific threat, the hippocampus, a different part, it interprets them as fear, it sends a signal to the amygdala, and what the amygdala does is it produces it reaches out to the pituitary gland and asks for the hormones that are going to help with the response. Primarily, these are adrenaline and cortisol. And what that does is it gets your body prepared to respond to a threat. If a tiger is chasing you, you would want to be able to move your body faster. You'd want to have increased respiration rate. You'd want your blood rate to be going faster. You'd want to have all of your energy around, how do I get away from this threat? So things like digestion will slow down. So the psychological impact, the way that our body responds to having these heightened levels of chemicals kind of going through our system are jitteriness, unease, and fear, which I kind of already mentioned. So the interesting thing about it is this is meant to be a short-term response. If we're having to run from a tiger for miles and miles and months, probably that tiger's gonna get us. We just can't maintain it for a really long time. So when I talk about us being overwhelmed from the kind of confluence of events, I mean it from a physiological point too. We've had these chemicals kind of coursing through us for so long that we're not really noticing them anymore, that we're just kind of always on edge. And because it's every day now, you don't even notice the fact that you're escalated, which is really, really hard. We get tired.
Talisha, thank you. I heard you talk about the impact of this on, I guess, the role that the amygdala plays for memory, decision-making, and emotional response, and then the impact of these hormones, stress hormones, on those functions, right? And so it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about memory, decision-making, emotional response. Okay, no wonder we are absolutely exhausted and we're hitting a wall. But I wonder if there are actual signs and symptoms. You know, how does all this manifest itself in impeding our daily functions? What are some examples of that?
Okay, so it does. It shows up in a lot of different ways. People are having difficulty concentrating for long periods of time, maintaining focus. It looks like increased psychomotor agitation, which I'm doing right now, the kind of increased movement. In this case, it's to keep someone occupied. But I have a 6-year-old at home, and I've noticed that she paces. And what 6-year-old do you know that paces? Well, 6-year-olds who are in a fight and flight response all the time. It looks like people, like you mentioned, poor memory, having a hard time absorbing and retaining and regurgitating information, which has a lot of impact on a college campus, as you might imagine. Sleep challenges, having a hard time falling asleep, having a hard time staying asleep, having a hard time getting back to sleep. Again, if you think that there's a tiger that's out to get you, falling and sleeping deeply is not something that's supposed to keep you safe, even though in real life, that's what we need on a day-to-day basis in order to be our best. People struggling with their weight. I've seen people joking about the COVID-19 kind of in the way that we used to talk about the freshman 15, because we eat for comfort. There's nothing wrong with eating for comfort, but it's a thing where we're not getting outside maybe as much as we used to, or we don't feel safe depending on the color of our skin and what our neighborhood looks like to go out and be as active as maybe we would on a normal basis. And it also looks like irritability, people having short tempers and snapping at each other over things that normally wouldn't bother us when we're on top of each other in ways that we used to have breaks on a regular basis. And I mean, our nerves maybe get rubbed a little bit raw. And struggles with executive functioning, which is the ability to plan and execute a plan. What do I need to do first? What do I need to do next? What steps do I need to take to accomplish that? again, anyone who is required to kind of focus down to complete their job, they probably are having a harder time doing those things right now. It's kind of like the idea of bandwidth. We only have so much bandwidth that we can devote to our lives. And when a percent of it is always over here, worried about the election, worried about my parent who maybe has some pre-existing conditions and are they being exposed, worrying about, okay, what happens next in the context of Breonna Taylor and other people with Black and brown skin who are having to interact with our society that's kind of indicating that they don't want to do that in a way that is fair and equitable. When you have so much of your bandwidth devoted to that, yeah, you can't do things as well as you would maybe like to do. And there are reports, surprise, surprise, of increasing levels of anxiety and depression kind of across the country and across the world, and as well as increased feelings of isolation. I think people are feeling kind of small as they contemplate kind of who they are and what they feel like they can do in the context of everything that's going on.
Talisha, thank you. And Wes, I promise we'll get to you in just a moment here, but Talisha has me kind of on a roll with respect to understanding of some of the science perhaps behind everything that we are experiencing and talking about. So often in our society, we celebrate certain traits and qualities, right? For example, resilience is one of them. The strength of character to meet problems head on. And so, in fact, our society has conditioned us that that's how we should be all the time. And when we are not, perhaps we start feeling down on ourselves and we start hiding some of these things or perhaps not necessarily noticing them or looking for them in the people that we work with, our loved ones. And it's important that we do. It's important that we pay attention. What would you suggest that we do if we in ourselves or in someone that we love are seeing these signs and symptoms that you just talked about?
And this is what I do. This is what I spend my day doing. When people are coming to me, when students are coming and saying, I'm having such a hard time, these are the types of things that I say to them. So the first thing that I encourage you to do for yourself, for your loved one, give yourself grace, give yourself space. This is hard. And it's easy to be like, oh, this isn't a thing. It's not impacting me, but that's not true. Give yourself grace and space because none of us are functioning optimally right now. We're all overloaded and we have been for 7 months and it looks like this is not going to let up anytime soon. It really doesn't. When you are struggling, for instance, with executing a plan, I kind of encourage the concrete activities that will support. So if you're having a hard time organizing your thoughts, make a list. What do I need to do? So you can concretely come back to it, check it off, move forward with the next thing because you've sat down and you've planned it out. These are kind of the things that you do when you're starting out, when you're learning how to do something. And so maybe just go back to the stuff that you know that works. If you're having a hard time with kind of some of the physiological response, if you find that your heart rate is going, if you find that you're having a hard time with memory, I kind of encourage grounding type activities, things like slow, deliberate breathing, things like yoga, things like gardening. So many people who have gotten into gardening over the past 7 months, they have their fingers in the soil and they see kind of I've done this and now I have this product and this flower or this fruit. It's really nice. Recognize and respect what you can and can't control. I was a little bit stressed. I can't believe the baby's going to be with me, but you know what? This is what needed to happen. And I can't control the fact that the doctor's appointment that was available had us running right into kind of the way that things happen today. And again, giving grace and being flexible when it happens. Don't expect perfection of yourself. I would hope that you give yourself grace even in optimal situations to not always expect perfection. But perfection right now is this elusive thing that's going to drive you crazy if you're trying to reach it and attain it, if you're mad at yourself for not getting there.
And Talisha, I think that's so important also in terms of giving that grace and space to people that we work with, right?
Absolutely.
And so maybe this is a good time for us to talk a little bit. I'd love for you and Wes both to maybe give some examples of how you are seeing some organizations doing a good job of giving grace and space to the people that work there. I'll give you an example of one that's not doing a good job. There was a school in Florida, I will not name which university, but they made a decision that their employees may not have children at home with them when they're working remotely. And that was mind-boggling to me when I read that. I hope they've changed that decision since then. But can you and Wes maybe give a couple of examples of where you have seen organizations that are doing a good job of being deliberate with their employees about all this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, part of this is because the structures and the institutions we're working in are set up for a different world than the one we're living in. And, we can kind of like push on and pretend like things haven't changed, but they really have. And so how do we rethink our structures? I mean, many of you are a part of churches and meetings that are having to do the same kind of thing. How do we rethink the structure of our communities so that we can continue to go in a way that maybe doesn't create hardship? When the pandemic was first happening, I remember one organization that I kind of follow online, basically giving their employees a whole week off, and just saying, okay, for the next like 4 days or 5 days, we know that like things are about to get really wild. And you're going to have to figure out childcare. You're going to need to go get certain supplies. You're going to need to make arrangements for school. You may need to go get some technology. So we're giving the entire company this week off to just get ready for whatever is coming. I know that I was talking with a friend yesterday who said that another company they're aware of just gave all of their employees $300 each to buy weights and like exercise stuff for their house, because like we're still here, we're still not able to do a whole lot. And they're saying, look, your physical health is really important and as a part of your emotional health. Others have said, okay, what used to be 40 hours is now 32 hours. So we expect, full-time is now 32 hours for everyone in the company because everything takes longer and is more stressful with family members and that sort of thing. So I think there are ways in which those are just like little examples of structural pieces that can move and change to make space because otherwise we're trying to do the normal stuff with all of the extra bandwidth stuff that Talisha has been talking about. And that is extremely exhausting.
And you know what, Wes, you came up with kind of several of the examples that I had thought of. I think the companies that have done it well are the ones who recognize that so many of the systems that enable their employees to do what they need to do are not functioning. And so their employees are trying to do 50 million things at once. They're trying to virtual school children who would normally be out of the room. They're trying to maybe care for parents who normally would be in other places. The companies that have allowed workers to not just go virtual, but also remote, recognizing that families have decided to consolidate so that grandparents can help with childcare. There are some companies that are doing it well. I do think in a lot of ways the system is struggling as much as us individuals are, though.
Thank you for that, Wes and Talisha. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about perhaps a historical viewpoint. Wes, have we in history before seen such a convergence of health crisis, political instability, and moral dilemmas?
When we were talking and planning this out, thinking one of the things that I, as a biblical scholar and theologian, find helpful is to realize this isn't the first time that we as humans have dealt with these kinds of things, and to recognize the fact that the kinds of issues that we see today are long and have deep roots in human society. So, I look back at the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament, and I look at the book of Exodus, and I look at, a kind of a liberation reading of those stories where God was, where the people who were, the Hebrew people who were enslaved there, were living in the midst of empire, and what it looked like for God to not only free those people, but to challenge empire. And what happens? Plagues start to happen, and there's a long history of plagues that are coupled with empires that have gotten too big for their britches, and start to really buckle under the pressure of
Is it on?
their. Is it, or is that you or someone else?
No, we took care of it. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead and continue. Yeah, thanks.
So there's plenty of plagues that show up in biblical history and throughout human history that go along with the kinds of other issues around injustice that we face. I was just, as some of you probably know, I have a fondness for the book of Revelation, and I was just rereading Revelation 18, where there is a piece of text in chapter 18 that basically describes how Babylon, which was a stand-in for the Roman Empire, had become so corrupted that God was essentially telling the people, come out of empire. And yeah, so I just think, I don't know, like for me, it's helpful to recognize that not only are we not alone in this moment, but we're not alone historically, and that there have been communities who throughout human history have faced these same kinds of things and have sometimes responded poorly, but sometimes have responded very well. And what are the tools? What are the ways of thinking and understanding from that kind of historical perspective that might actually help us? So, these are patterns that we can identify certainly long before 2020 that can be addressed.
Wes, thank you. And of course, I know you won't do a shameless plug for yourself, but I will, that you have written a book about addressing some of these things. And so your vast knowledge, of course, comes from the fact that you're both a scholar of this and you have written about it. So Wes, tell us about the role of faith in helping people get through these kind of situations.
Well, if I was to build on the previous comment in terms of being a part of a larger story, that is a faith response, is to recognize I am standing in the continuum of a much larger story that has been unfolding for thousands or millions of years, and that this is what it means to be human, is to live morally, ethically, spiritually in the midst of these kinds of things. I have a mentor, teacher who talks about the struggle is the school, and thinking about how what it means to be in the midst of this is our education. It is the thing that shapes us. And as much as we want to be through it, myself included, there's something about being in the midst of this and learning from it and growing from it and allowing it to, we were just talking about how our structures are unjust and aren't able to adapt. Those are all things that we can learn from in this moment. So I think that that's a faithful response. I think being able to, on a more kind of critical level, being able to identify the distorted narratives of nationalism, the distorted narratives around racism and poverty that continue to plague American society, and being able to point out and say, this is not okay. It's not okay from a secular moral perspective. It's not okay from a moral perspective. It's not okay from a faith perspective. And here are responses. Here are alternatives to the systems that we're living in. And I think another piece that I find inspiring goes back to Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, you have multiple instances where the author talks about what he calls the multitude. And the multitude is maybe in our language today, we would talk about it as the beloved community, or we would talk about it as Reverend Barber talks about a fusion coalition, a collective of people who are resisting empire, who are resisting to become like empire, or to play by empire's rules, or to become so utterly distressed because of empire that we lose all hope, but in fact to stand as an alternative witness in this world. And I think that is a thing that gets me up in the morning and keeps me going. Is, okay, what does it mean for me to be in the multitude, and what does it mean for me to continue to help try to build the multitude so that we can create something different than what we have.
Wes, thank you. That's very insightful, and it's so, for me anyway, it's so helpful to have this context that you have shared with us. And I want to see if we can distill it a little bit further and maybe talk about some specific and tangible things that folks can do in terms of dealing with a faith-based response. Can you give us some specific ideas and thoughts?
Sure. I think on the one hand, there is what are the kinds of things that you do? I think that there are practices that might help me that may not work for someone else. And so, I want to be loose with this, but what are the kinds of things that help you to become unhooked from, a reactionary lashing out? What are the things that help you to become more non-anxious? What are the things that help you to kind of keep a clear head and to think patiently? What are those practices that you do in your own life? And I mean, Talisha has covered a lot of the things that we can do to help us to be as unhooked from a reactionary kind of stance as possible. I think that that's really important. So in the Christian tradition, there are many, many ways that happens. Forgiveness and confession are really important. So, hey, I'm really sorry that I have a short temper right now. I know that's not helping the family out or the workplace out, and I need a little extra forgiveness because of the way that I'm responding. So something as simple as that can really help kind of create a better environment. Just recognizing that. Obviously, things like prayer and meditation. And there's a million meditation and prayer apps that you can download and time yourself in the morning if you have a hard time sitting still like I do. So do that sort of thing. Having a regular practice of silence or meeting in silence with a community is an important part of the Quaker tradition and our practice around what does it mean to kind of be in the midst of all kinds of challenges and still be able to listen faithfully. So studying, so we just talked a little bit about the biblical theological arc of empire. So studying those texts, beginning to kind of see where you fit into that story and understand that there's a longer arc here. So I think these are all pieces. The other day, because of the miracle of the internet, I made a friend over Twitter who lives in the Philippines, and we had a phone call. And so which was like at 10 p.m. at night or something for me. But anyways, he's a Catholic, and he was talking about works of mercy and the importance of putting yourself in contact with the marginalized, and not just like, like a charitable thing, but actually being in community with people who are poor, who are those essential workers that we're talking about, who are the vulnerable. So if you are not, someone in that position being connected to people who are, so that you know what is really going on, because you may not really be affected by much of this right now and things seem great. Well, there are lots of people who are in a very different situation. So how do you put yourself into situations and contexts where you're hearing a bigger part of the story? So that is a faithful practice as well.
Wes, thank you for that. I love how you created space in your response for people to be able to use faith in the way that is personal to them. And I really appreciate that. As Talisha was talking earlier about, some of signs and symptoms that folks are dealing with, mine is waking up at 2 a.m. and not being able to go back to sleep. And it's almost happened every night since March. And so invariably in the mornings, my mind is just racing, and I find myself, the only way I can center is to engage in this prayer that is very personal to me. In fact, you'll laugh when I say half of it is in Persian and half of it is in English. And I go back and forth, in fact, between what it is that I'm praying about. And so, but that is my saving grace, if you would. Every morning, I have to do that, and my mind starts racing halfway in the middle of it, and I have to again center myself so I can finish my prayers. And I feel better when I'm actually done going through my prayer in the mornings. So Talisha, let's come back to you, because I'm sure others would join me in the interest they would have of learning how is this affecting our students.
Okay. It probably isn't surprising, considering the age that most of the students are on campus. There's kind of a divide right now between students who are kind of risk-seeking versus students who are risk-averse. So for our risk-seeking students, this is completely developmentally appropriate. In this age group, kind of right before your brain finishes maturing, is this idea that, it won't happen to me. I can do these things, and just because it's super dangerous doesn't mean that I will die. So I mean, we do have students who are maybe taking risks that we would prefer them not to take, especially with regards to mask wearing or social distancing or the lack thereof. But I think in a lot of ways we were kind of prepared for this. I think we've done a pretty good job of helping students to recognize that if they're taking risks, they are not taking risks alone. They're taking risks for the entire campus community. So to some degree, that's working. We also have students who are really, really risk averse. And I've had sessions, virtual sessions with students who talk about how they never leave their room. They're in their room for their classes, which are being held virtually. They're not really gathering with friends. They go to the cafeteria, grab food, and bring it back to their room. I've having conversations with students from kind of both extremes about how do you manage risk to a point that's appropriate for both them personally and okay for their community. I've noticed that in general, we're having students who have shorter fuses, not just for anger, although that's coming up, but they're higher strung and they get really upset a little bit faster than I've typically seen kind of in the time that here. I've had a couple of on-call calls from after hours, and I'd have to go back and look, but I think it's not been a huge number, but I think it's a pretty significant increase over what we had seen by this time last year, which is kind of the only way that I have to measure it, what's different versus what's the same. I will say that a lot of the things that are coming up kind of in session, both with me specifically and in the counseling center in general, they're still pretty typical for the student body. But we do have students who come and want to process some of these events. We have students who have experienced racially motivated violence. We have students who are experiencing gender discrimination. And again, that's not unusual for what students at Guilford want to talk about, but I think we're seeing a little bit more of it. Students are trying to figure out who they are and what their place is in the world and how they respond if it's happening to them, if it's happening to their friends, if it's happening to people they admire, people they love, if it's happening to people on the street. How do I engage around this and what do I do with it? And I think that comes from being a social justice oriented school like Guilford. And we're seeing some pretty typical symptoms of anxiety and depression, which makes sense. We always see those, and when there's more of that happening, we're going to see more of that. So yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's important that we all recognize that college students are being significantly affected by this pandemic, as well as the issues of racism and the political instability of our country. With respect to the pandemic, I want to make sure our guests know that Guilford's response through a health and safety task force that has been comprised of faculty, public safety, residence halls, dining, student life, has really been excellent. And in fact, because of the way that we have handled the situation, and I would say an emphasis on the values-based education that we have at Guilford, right? We have the values of community, integrity, excellence, justice, stewardship. These have all kind of manifested themselves in the way we have responded to the situation at hand, such that we are now into 5 weeks of fall semester and we only have one active positive case of COVID on campus. And not every institution in the country is having the same kind of success. And knock on wood, I hope you heard that, that our situation will stay just as positive as we go through the rest of this health crisis. So Talisha, I want to come back and see if you can share with us what support and advice are you offering students based on the way they're responding?
So when students are coming to me with maybe risk oriented challenges, I'll have a conversation with them around how you manage risk, how you judge risk. And it's interesting because there are models that help us kind of talk about risk from a standpoint of abstinence, right? It's impossible to avoid this, but how much are you willing to expose yourself to it? And what are the consequences if you do? Are there ways that people can get together safely? And the answer is yes, with their 6 feet of distance, if they're outside, if it's for a time limited. Are there ways that you can maybe mitigate your risk? Yes, the only thing that's 100% effective is staying in your room all the time by yourself, but is that really healthy for you? So I've had that conversation a couple of times with students, and I do think it's kind of sinking in, and I think it's been helpful for them to hear it in terms of consent and abstinence, and some terms that they've kind of talked about for years in several cases, even if it's applied in a different way. We've been helping students kind of work on regaining their executive functioning. This is especially helpful for students who find themselves getting kind of overwhelmed and kind of falling into urgency and crisis moments. And so things along the lines of, all right, how do you break this task down? What comes first, what comes next? Pointing to resources on campus, like the Learning and Writing Commons, that are really, that specialize in helping students with this and making sure that students are aware of the resources that are available. I like to remind students that they are doing an amazing job, even if they think that they're not. The fact that they are here and the fact that they're maintaining, the fact that they're coming and talking to me, or that they're talking to their friends or their professors or whoever their trusted people are. Like, that's what you have to do to help yourself gain perspective and to recognize that maybe you think you're doing awful, but when you look at the big picture, no, you're doing really good. I encourage them to have grace for themselves and to seek those small joys, because it's hard to do hard things all the time continuously. You've got to find kind of little things here and there to bring you joy in this time where it's really easy to lose sight of some of that.
Talisha, thank you. I love the way you contextualize that, particularly in terms of the role you play to tell students they're doing great. And I think that's so important that we all take the time to provide that sort of observation and support to one another, whether it's people that are our loved ones, our colleagues, our friends, to stop and say, I am observing and I thank you and I see in you the way you are responding to the situation with grace, with poise. You're doing well, and I love the way you put that. Wes, I have been so impressed with the way that our community is now seeing incredible levels of programming coming out of the Intercultural Engagement Center, the Friends Center, and I would like to ask for you to speak just for a couple of minutes to the heightened role that specifically the Friends Center is playing for supporting our community of students, faculty, and staff through all of this.
Well, to tag on to what you and Talisha were just saying, I mean, one of the things is really trying to continue to be a positive and caring voice on campus. So there have been a number of instances over email and over video, less so in person, because there haven't been as many opportunities for that, but saying, I think you're doing a really good job. I really appreciate your help. You know, it's good enough to just do the best that you can. You know, saying things like that to students, to staff, and to faculty, and in many cases, you know, people are like, "That's the first time I've heard that recently. Thank you very much." So just trying, I mean, at a very basic level, just trying to be a caring voice whenever we have the opportunity. And to really, you know, when we're in this environment nationally, in such a divisive environment, when we have plenty of challenges that we face as a college, to really try and support you know, positive movement and ways of thinking rather than kind of rivalry and building up over and against some other, or you know, participating in the kind of scapegoating of people that we really love to do, but is really not good for us to do. Trying to help kind of steer those conversations and feelings and emotions. So, you know, that's the sort of the interpersonal and emotional, some of the emotional work. But in terms of programming, we continue to do meetings for centering silence on campus, and we make that available through the Buzz and, you know, our just newsletters and emails and that sort of thing. So just opportunity for folks to gather and have a little practice of silence, and we don't just have silence, we check in and kind of have conversation with each other and try to use that as an opportunity to build community with each other and just support. Working on some informal times. We just got 8 camp chairs delivered to Friends Center the other day as a gift from New Garden Friends. So thank you, New Garden Friends, who are on the call, so that we can sit outside Friends Center in a big circle and, you know, just have some kind of, you know, informal, socially distant time together with students. So we're looking forward to some of those opportunities with our programming, so that, you know, when appropriate and with plenty of safety, we can do some things in person, because it really makes a difference, especially I think for students, to be able to see one another and connect in that way. So making opportunities for that. We're working on, we'll have throughout the semester, we're going to have some larger community gatherings to give up people opportunity to, you know, sort of in a, you know, for those of you who are familiar with Quaker practice, kind of in a almost in a worship sharing kind of mode, an opportunity for folks to just kind of share collectively as a community grief and struggle and what folks are dealing with, and to make a space for where that is okay to talk about. And there's not going to be answers. This isn't like a town hall where there's a bunch of information. It really will be just a space for folks to kind of, you know, be able to share some of what they're feeling, and to try to provide, I guess, in a way, kind of a nourishing space. And then I guess another thing I wanted to lift up quickly was so last year we received a grant from the Interfaith Youth Corps. Evelyn Jaden, who was working with us at that point, got a grant from IFYC to begin building interfaith dialogues as a program on campus. So the grant was around getting the training and kind of getting all that set up. Well, we're continuing that, and we actually had our first one on Tuesday, and they're called Connecting Conversations. And the idea is to have interfaith leaders on campus coming and then meeting with students and kind of entering into conversations across religious difference as a mode of trying to both model, good dialogue, but also build relationships and what IFOIC calls affirmative knowledge of other people in other religious traditions. They have good research that shows that the more affirmative knowledge we can have of people in other religious traditions, the less likely we are to engage in highly divisive, prejudiced sort of behaviors. So that's something that we're working on as well.
Great. Thank you, Wes. Thanks for sharing that. And both you and Talisha letting us know how the services that you oversee, both of you, are serving as such important factors for supporting our students through the crises, if not, there's not just one, the multiple crises at hand. So we have just about enough time left for a couple of quick questions that have been submitted by our guests. And I'm going to ask the first one of Wes and then the second one of Talisha. Kate in Greensboro asks, will the Underground Railroad tours be continued in the future when the pandemic subsides?
Hi, Kate. Yes, they will. Obviously, we're not doing anything in person at the moment, save, I actually did take, we had a class in the 3-week, when we were meeting outside. We were using the woods primarily as our classroom, which was pretty amazing. It's a pretty good classroom if you're going to have one. And so we went out and we did the Underground Railroad tree out there. And so that was one in which a tour and kind of a session for telling stories happened. But generally right now we're not doing that because of COVID largely, but also we need to regroup as we have less staff that we're working with. So once we get through the pandemic, we will start doing the tours again. But we will need to restructure how that happens. So I'm not exactly sure yet in what capacity or what it'll look like. But yes, absolutely, it's something that I'm very committed to.
Thank you, Wes, and thanks for that great question, Kate. And for those of you who may not be aware, a few years back, Wes worked on a grant with the Tannenbaum Sternberger Foundation to actually receive funding that allowed for us to also create a curriculum around the Underground Railroad that is being taught in public schools in Guilford County. The next question is from also an alum, Michael in Greensboro, who says, I worry very much about how much turmoil Guilford students are experiencing. The pandemic and social unrest each present a different but challenging disruption to their education that their generation must learn to process. But Guilford students are also experiencing the added pain of loss from departure of staff and faculty they care for. How can we as alumni and friends help support the student community? Talisha, would you like to tackle the response to that question?
Sure, I'll give it a try. I think the thing we have to do is absolutely respect the grief that comes both from everything that's happening and from the specific things that are happening on our campus. Give students a space to mourn and to empathize with them to the degree that you can. It is hard when the people that you expect to be there to support you aren't able to be there for whatever reason, voluntary or involuntary. I think that we have to continue to offer our expertise. What is it that we know, that we do, that we specifically, that I can do to support that's, specific to me and my abilities? Because we all know what it means to be a Guilford student and the critical thinking skills that come out of the education that Guilford provides. And while we're not all faculty, I think we all have ways that we can contribute, whether it's by providing some level of emotional support, or whether it's by linking to community resources or internships, or providing mentorship services. I know that it's kind of cliche to be like, yeah, everybody has their part that they can do. But I mean, I think that's true. We do have the things that we can do. And if for whatever reason, the effort that you can provide, you don't know that you think you can do things, maybe that's when we reach out to ARA and say, is there a way that we can provide financial support to the college, to students in ways that come back out? So I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, ARA. What are other steps that people can take to support the college and students at this time?
Well, thank you, Talisha. And I love the way you did that. We hadn't even talked about you doing that. So you're a pro. And certainly there are ways that alums and benefactors of the college can support us at this moment in time by volunteering and also your philanthropy. And in the communication that we will send in follow-up to this coffee chat, and Ginny had asked whether there will be a recording available to watch. Yes, there will be one, and it will be included in that communication. We will also share with you the link for volunteering and also the link for making a gift in support of the college. Those are absolutely viable ways, but I also want to make sure that Michael knows that I understand the significance of that question. And it is a very difficult set of circumstances, and I hope that we can go back to what Talisha said at the very beginning, which is to give ourselves and give our community grace and space. We need grace and space more so than I've ever experienced in a professional setting before, and I'm glad that I'm in a community that values those qualities. So I want to thank both of you. I am honored to have Wes and Talisha as my colleagues, and for those of you who are joining us on this program, I think you can see why I feel that way. I want to close with a little bit of a history lesson, if that's okay. J. Franklin Davis was a member of the Guilford College faculty when we had in fact just become Guilford College at the end of the 19th century from having been New Garden boarding school. And he stayed on as a member of the faculty into the 20th century. And J. Franklin Davis, as a member of the faculty, his children went to Guilford College, one of them, Margaret Davis Winslow, whose grandson, Ed Winslow, is now the chair of the Board of Trustees. Margaret Davis Winslow wrote a book called A Gift from Grandmother, and it basically chronicles her experiences as a child growing up on Guilford's campus and then going to Guilford College as a student and then being an alumna of Guilford College. And at the end of her book, she shares a poem called The Guilford Spirit by Joshua Crane, graduate of 1954. And the poem ends with, "What mystic spirit dwells so quietly among us here? It is the soul of this place, strengthened through the years, sustained with unfailing faith. Here the Guilford spirit dwells, this soul, immortal part of God." Thank you all for joining us today, and we will be in touch with you with the email communication in the next day or so. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.